Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back for another space. This one is basically a epilogue of the Kursk saga. It's going to be rather succinct. I wasn't planning on doing it today. The logic was that Kursk would have been more or less folded by the 15th of March. But due to unforeseen circumstances, it was hastened to the point that yet another tunnel assault on the Russian side precipitated the complete hollowing and folding of the northern salient, along with the cutoff of the main core of the salient due to the previous penetration through the Guevo passage under Melovoy towards the Ukrainian border. Now, in reality, the Kursk situation was already precarious for the Ukrainians since roughly January 2025. From December already, a lot of cracks were appearing, as I have already described it. The main problem was that Ukrainians were mostly trying to defend on plots, so without a continuous line of defense. That means that they would have plots of defenders, mostly on fortified or quasi-fortified trenches, a lot less manned roads because they need to use them themselves for deeper penetration, tactical maneuver in order to, as we saw it multiple times, try and offer a breather to the occupying forces. And generally speaking, Kursk was actually done the moment the forward progress stopped. So basically roughly around the 15th to the 18th of August 2024. Now, I know it's quite a big word to say that it was over within a week or 10 days after the start of the operation, but I already explained why into a space dated August 9, 2024, and I made a thread the very same day describing more or less the situation, how it happened. I have to admit that I didn't expect the Ukrainian forces to maintain a presence in Kursk for that long, especially as we discussed previously that Kursk was a parallel race with Pokrovsk, or generally speaking with the Donetsk area, so it was how much Ukrainians were going to lose gradually in Kursk and how much that would cost them in Pokrovsk. And purely on that aspect, so when it comes to accountancy in lost or gained terrain, Kursk was a dismal failure. As I already explained, in order to grab momentarily about 1,000 square kilometers of the Russian Federation, the Ukrainian forces lost about 3 to 3.6 thousand square kilometers within Ukraine. And of course, they lost it in some of the worst areas and most defended actually areas in Donbass. So basically, Ugledar fell, the whole salient from Ocheretino to Pokrovsk. After that, there was a rollback in Toretsk, although Toretsk is being counterattacked. On that one, I already explained why. Maybe we're going to touch a little word. But the most important part is that the Kursk salient not only was a tactical failure, but it was also a complete attrition failure when it came to the Ukrainian forces. I already stated the number based on Oryx, although our internal numbers, courtesy of Jay, courtesy of Sibir, and other people from the Timor Criminal, are clearly pointing out a understatement of the losses on the Ukrainian side, and a good chunk of it is due to the fact that the Kursk Oblast losses are extremely important. Based purely on Oryx, we have roughly 30% extra losses from August 6th to March 1st, 2025, August 6th, 2024 to March 1st, 2025. And compared to what Oryx found about the Russians, we are currently into a ratio of roughly, well, 1.5, to be honest. When it comes to the losses largo sensu, strictly with the Oryx account, we are at 1.9 from August 6th to March 1st, 2025. But when we start analyzing properly and with our sources, we can see that since the beginning of Kursk, Oryx started to, or people that contribute to Oryx started to omit a flurry of losses, most of them based on the fact that there was no obvious result, although as we've seen later on, we had confirmed casualties, confirmed destruction of the state equipment that was just quote-unquote seen as hit from the Russian, notably wire-guided FPVs. But that's something else. We're not going to touch the BS of Oryx. It doesn't actually matter. Because the trend is there, as I said, without Kursk, the Ukrainian losses would have remained more or less on the same line as the year 2023. With Kursk alone, I'm not going to add our losses and their composition. The Ukrainians lost somewhere around 22% extra on the whole front line compared to 2023. So that's the extra losses in 2024. And then there was a huge acceleration, as I explained already, in 2025, from the 3rd of January 2025 to the 1st of March 2025. Ukrainians lost 565 assets, and the Russians lost 865 assets from January 2 to February 28, 2025. But even if you completely stabilize the losses at some point, you need to take into account that Oryx hasn't updated since the 1st of March. So on that aspect, there are probably a lot of extra losses that are going to be added on both sides, of course. So generally speaking, when you do just that analysis, we are at about 1.5 losses as a positive ratio for Eagle. So basically 1.5 Russian vehicles lost for each and every Ukrainian vehicle or asset lost. It's one of the lowest ratios. The low ratio was actually the very first week of the conflict, when Ukrainians were at 1 versus 1.2. And then after that, you had a flurry of losses, so that ratio went on the other side. Now, the problem when it comes to the Kursk ratio of losses, it's pretty actually simple. I explained that the very first day of the counteroffensive, Kursk is a very bad place to start a counteroffensive without the proper plan, the proper troops, and a proper command structure. As I explained, initially Ukrainians started to pull together a bunch of different units and subunits. They affected those subunits to their own commandment. The chain of command on the higher up was fractioned, and the equipment was fractioned, which meant that they had a hodgepodge of equipment, hodgepodge of assets, hodgepodge of maintenance and sustainment structures, and more or less it ended up with, well, initially quite a good advance, but by day 5 already, once they lost their propulsive momentum towards Korenovo. So basically, they couldn't break through Korenovo to go against Rilsk and start to take the west to east salient towards Kurchatov. It was done. So the whole plan, this is more or less what we are now agreeing on within Team War Criminal, is that there was not a single aim. So basically, it's not just go to Kurchatov and take over the NPP, although I probably wouldn't put it behind these assholes, but it was probably to expand the area of control sufficiently so as to make the Russians panic and pull a large amount of troops from Donetsk. And as I explained, the bigger problem for the Ukrainians is that by doing Kursk, which was one of the, I'd say, non-tangibles that Team War Criminal ignored, we said that an operation needed to happen before September, somewhere within Ukraine, and we excluded Kursk or the Russian border simply because it would be a complete lunacy, given that to go through Russia, you would just have to expand your logistic lines. But most importantly, the axis that would be the most beneficial to the Ukrainians, which was the Belgorod axis, which gave you access to a very large city on the Russian side, very close to the front line, and directly on the doorstep of Kharkov. So basically would allow the Ukrainians to have a way better logistical pool. Well, it was already occupied since May 2024, where the Russians launched this initially thought as a large-scale offensive, although it panned out pretty quickly that it was a large diversion of troops, which basically resulted in the Russians actually accelerating from June, July, and then August 2024 in their control of the Ukrainian territory. Now, the problem with that, as I said, we completely overlooked it. We just gave more or less the assessment that there would have to be a Ukrainian counter somewhere or a Ukrainian attempt somewhere. But Kursk made the least sense, honestly, given that it would take the Ukrainians to reach the city itself, at least 80 kilometers of movement, which means 80 kilometers of logistical lines. And Ukraine, so far, I already explained, had never managed to control over 60 kilometers of logistical lines without breaking down. And that aspect was, unfortunately, the Kharkov counteroffensive that led actually to the belief that Ukraine could win this war in 2022. Then, of course, we knew that how in 2023. So the moment that Ukrainian logistics, which were ill-prepared, consist of a hodgepodge of units and a hodgepodge of assets, were unleashed into the Suja plain, because that's exactly what happened, well, everything would have depended on how badly the Russians were prepared over there. Now, the Ukrainians did a lot of shit in Suja, especially at the beginning. A lot of people would speak about perfidy, about war crimes and stuff like that. Not very important, actually, because, I mean, since the beginning, Ukrainians comported themselves like this, and it had a lot to do with the chip on the shoulders they had for the last two conflicts, 2014-15, and the small flare-up in 2017. So it was expected for Ukrainians to be assholes and to be this kind of small mentality players which would go for something flashy, but on the long term useless, and which would also fold as fast as possible. Now, the big issue is that the folding aspect that we were expecting within 2 months, given the moment they got stopped in Korenovo, it actually never happened. Not because like it didn't make sense, but simply because the Ukrainians, for some reason, tried to justify the offensive and invasion of Kursk with some kind of attempt to bargain that territory against a larger surface of Ukrainian land. Notably, it was supposed to they were supposed to exchange whatever they had in Kursk with at least one oblast. That's what, up to the 7th of February, was claimed by at least 3 different uh, Ukrainian bloggers slash soldiers. This, of course, was a complete madness. It was never going to fly. I mean, they themselves, they knew this. And this is why the space today is called post-truth peak, because Kursk was exactly what's going wrong in this war on both sides, but especially on the Ukrainian side. And ironically enough, it's the post-truth peddled by some of the headhunters of the new American administration that are actually sinking the willpower actually of the Ukrainian forces. And of course, I'm hinting at the main comments done by Vance, Trump, and friends when it came to, basically how Ukraine is doing in the war, which is not good, but not as bad as being sold by the U.S. administration. But also, some of the guys like Zelensky would be a dictator. He's actually an autocrat. With a security apparatus, but it's not a dictatorship in the sense that it's still a large majority of Ukrainian people that want to continue the war by default. It doesn't mean that these people want absolutely to fight to the death. They just are not ready to give up, because the kind of damage the war is doing to the Ukrainian population is still largely hidden by these security and propaganda apparatus that are actually causing large damage to the Ukrainian military power itself. So why Kursk is post-truth? Well, basically, first and foremost, as I said, people who knew what Kursk was going to be about, people who were analyzing the forces employed, the type of units, the tactics used, and most importantly, the general lack of preparation of the offensive. I know that people are going to say, how do you mean lack of preparation? Yes, well, basically lack of preparation because the sustainment of the Suja salient, as we saw the last couple of days with the large massacre of equipment by the Rubicon group, mostly through optical fiber, basically was 100 to 150 vehicles that would run supply for the troops within the salient. If we need to make a kind of calculus over those 100, 150 vehicles, we would arrive to roughly about 250 tons of equipment and supplies being shipped per round. So once you start making this logic, this calculus, 250 tons in average, and it's 250 tons because unfortunately Ukrainians were using mostly civilian equipment to ferry the needed supply. And another part was, of course, ferried by organic means. So basically, since the beginning, we saw that the Russian senators or the MRAPs or the Maxpos and so forth and so on were also serving this role of logistical cog. So those 250 tons per round basically would help sustain about 1,000 people when it comes to everything. This would explain the dire situation of the defense and the need for the Ukrainians to actually have a sustained resupply, because each and every time you would rely on these 150, 160 vehicles, so basically each and every time you can only get through supplies and equipment and food for about 1,000 people each and every time. So if we say that these guys were doing a carousel of 3 to 4 times per week, that would mean that the maximum people that would be in the salad at that point would be between 3,000 and 4,000 people. You may understand that by roughly December 2024, the silent was already halved. So they were basically like 550 or 560 square kilometers, which meant that whatever the force was initially in Kursk, some said, like us, that the initial invasion was basically 2 battalions and a total force of roughly 1 brigade that was busy doing that. And then little by little, you had more and more units coming by because the Ukrainians needed to hold on the territory. And we ended up with a force between 6 and 8,000, 8 or 10,000, depending on who you listen. These troops need to be rotated very, very fast, mostly because, as we saw, although initially they had a lot of success into advancing as fast as possible to the Suja plain, they also had their first casualties pretty fast on. I mean, the very first day, they lost at least 13 to 14 vehicles and probably between 60 to 80 people. Of course, this was compensated by a large haul of Russian captives, and as I said, due to the uh, blitz attack, a lot of like terminal casualties, somewhere between 60 and 100 casualties within the 2 first days on the Russian side. Uh, Ukrainians even gloated about the fact that they killed people that were unarmed because they weren't expecting to be attacked. And then, of course, within 4 to 5 days, we had another trouble with a large number of casualties due to the HIMARS attack on a convoy, which was unfortunately burned by the ferry troops themselves, because apparently a couple of them had made videos on them coming through that road from Rilsk. Now, the problem that affected the Ukrainians pretty fast in Kursk, as I said, was a lack of control, a lack of stable lines. So we can speak about Safronovka, we can speak about Giri, we can speak about a lot of issues that happened to them between August and September. By September 9th, we had already a first wave of counterattack from the Russian side, which, as I said, first of all, completely cleared up Korenovo, advanced up to the Snagost, and took back between 180 and 210 square kilometers off the bat. At that moment, a lot of people, especially us at Timor Criminal, thought, okay, we're starting 9th of September, about 200 square kilometers. Within 2 to 3 weeks, we would be at the 200 to 300 kilometers that I pointed out into the day one analysis, which is the heights along the Suja plain, which are the defensive peak of the Suja city itself, plus Daloshenka, Goncharovka, and so forth and so on. Well, unfortunately, Ukrainians went very fast to establish lines of defense, and especially FPV lines of defense, which, gave already a follow-up to that, because suddenly we had Pokrovsk-style losses on both sides, but unfortunately on the Russian side, given that the Russians started head-on to attack the lines and try and not allow the Ukrainians to dig in and take position with the city and the suburbs of Suja, which would have allowed them to have a far stronger position to defend. And I mean, to this day, they are still not kicked out of the area. However, the land that they control within the Suja plain, but in the Kursk Oblast, is extremely small. So basically, we are currently less than 1% of the Kursk Oblast, which, while meaningless, still has a lot of symbolic value when it comes to both Ukrainians and Russians. So what failed, basically, both on our assessment on the Russian side, but also in the Ukrainian plan initially? Well, as I said, the Ukrainian plan made no sense from the beginning, because, as I said, it would open up to the acceptance from Zelensky that the assets he was throwing to Kursk, for whatever reason and for whatever goal, were better spent, as I said, in Kursk, that led to rot and get destroyed in Pokrovsk. The moment that Zelensky made that decision and showed to the world that we will not start defending Donetsk because probably we will not be able to keep the Russians out of that city, is the epitome of how the Ukrainians have thought all over this war. Now, of course, the biggest issue that Ukrainians faced with Kursk is that, in my opinion, of course, is that the Ukrainian Defense Ministry probably had a bunch of people telling them just not do it, simply because the risks far outweigh whatever success you might get from them. And of course, it was logical. First of all, they had no actual humans on the spot. Although a lot of images circulated, it remained still a very small force initially, although it grew slowly. And most importantly, there where the Ukrainians thought they would have the advance, because for a long while, remember guys, Ukrainian FPVs were synonymous with death, with game changer, with an absolute juggernaut of a system. And then the Russians replied the same way they actually replied during the counter in 2023, with exactly the same product, an FPV, but with optical fiber. So tactically and logistically, the Russian forces, although they stuttered the first week, let's say the first 10 days, they reestablished, first of all, a link of control over the Korenovo area that they pushed forward, reduced two small pockets, including one that had air defense. It was Tunguska, up to the kilometer 37 of the railway from Risk to Kurchatov. And generally speaking, as I said, made sure that Kursk, as it stood back then, the way the Ukrainians were envisioning, would actually end very poorly, very rapidly on. And that's why I said Giria Safonovka announced exactly how the war would go, which was Ukrainians not being able to overextend themselves to try to gain new territory without losing the equipment. And this pattern simply was verified all over the excursion in Kursk. After the initial pushes, then we had the 5th of September Veseloy counter that was attempting to cut the push from the Korenovo to Snagost area from the Russian side. That one failed spectacularly. Remember that Ukrainians called that shit the Ukraine Bagration, which once again shows how much of a poverty level mentality the Ukrainians are showing in this war. It has nothing to do with how they consider war, how they want to see it, how they want to wage it. It has to do with the fact that they want to rub every single aspect of it to the Russians' face, which doesn't lead to the Russians being demobilized or demoralized. It leads to the contrary, as we saw with the Super Zigro Bros attack through the tunnel once more. And it's exactly what I said. It goes perfectly with the narrative of post-truth. Whatever the Ukrainians are saying about the Russians, you can rest assured that it is a projection of their own condition. So when the Ukrainians speak about Russians with donkeys, yes, of course, you're going to have some fringe cases, but the problem is that unless I'm stupid or we're all stupid or impaired, what Mongolians that are humping donkeys with bone knives are conquering still more territory that Ukrainians were able to conserve from Kursk after 6 months of operation. And this is only in the month of February, by the way. So what is this about? Well, it's pretty simple. As I said, the Ukrainian leadership enjoyed a absolute and unparalleled advantage over the public relations campaigns that they led by doing something that one of the members of the Blackbird group called a total focus on the other side. So basically, they blinded themselves by this propaganda narrative that initially was backed actually by results. I already explained this. However, the more you advance and the more you get into the attrition war, you cannot avoid these losses, and we know how it works. As you have the least weight on these less assets, and I do not agree with the assessment that the Western allies deliver too little too late. I'm going to repeat, you guys, the total amount of money that was spent on Ukraine, in a way or another, is about $317 billion, which divided by 3 for the 3 years is over $100 billion a fucking year. And this, of course, part of it, about 70, 80 billion, is money that is spent either in Europe or in the US. But still, it leaves you with about 270, 230 billion dollars, which, well, it's an awful lot of money for a small country like Ukraine. It's more or less, given the last GDP, about 1.4 times the yearly GDP of Ukraine that they received over the course of 3 years. Basically, a huge stimulus program for the country, mostly explicable by the fact that it lost between 6 and 8 billion people very early on, and a lot of them simply didn't come back. And during the years, we had two major bleeding of the Ukrainian population. So 2023, about 700,000 people, and in 2024, about 400,000 people that left the country. On top of, as I said, the 6 to 8 million that left initially, and of which a couple returned. The post-truth in this regard is that Ukrainians still are ignoring this, because the whole logic that is prevailing now, initially it was liberating territory, giving it back to the Russians, so forth, so on, and then slowly changed into surviving as a free independent country, keeping our democracy, whatever, yada, yada, yada. Now, this post-truth might sound actually harsh, because in a certain sense, it's a process of Finlandization. The Finns lost the war twice against the Soviet Union, but they led the narrative that, in fact, the Soviets had lost because they couldn't subjugate the whole of Finland. Actually, the Soviets, as everybody knows, got a way better deal than what they initially asked the Finns to get them. And most importantly, nurtured Finland completely, and were sure that nothing's going to happen towards St. Petersburg, although by the time it was Leningrad, from the Finnish area, as it happens in the interwar period between the Winter War and then the Continuation War. So, for Ukraine, it's exactly the same thing. The whole point on the Ukrainian side is not to tell the truth anymore. And that's how we got Kursk down to the latest Peremoga tactic, where allegedly 80 out of 100 Russian special forces that traveled through the tunnel got spotted and annihilated. Well, the funny part is that whatever was shown by the Ukrainians, first of all, for sure, it wouldn't even show about 100 guys getting out of the pipe or within the pipe. It doesn't really actually matter. But the option that the Russians had chosen had nothing to do with what Ukrainians were explaining. As we saw, based on the geolocations, the most likely, and what is happening right now, goal of the Russian intelligence party was to go throughout that pipe and lay a ambush to the retreating forces from Malaya Lokna. In case you missed it, the first problem that happened to Ukraine is that they felt they were bypassed by the Russians in Martinovka, and they fell back. Those troops probably got peppered and ambushed by many ways, and the Russian party that got out of the tunnel that landed very close to Suja, its role wasn't to actually enter Suja simply because there weren't enough. Even 100 people starting to fight inside of Suja would have been suicidal. No, the logic, as I said, was to cut. I'm going to post you exactly what I meant by that. To cut the silent more or less in the middle, by putting down a barrage. So basically, this one, you can see that on the image that I just posted, you have the movement from Martinovka popping out roughly at the area where we saw them getting targeted by HIMARS and artillery, rather badly, by the way, and then going forward, blocking the troops that are coming from the northern salient, from Malaya Lokta, Kazachna Lokta, and so on, and establishing a clear cut between the northern salient and the southern salient to go by with the cut from Plekovo Guevo that already existed, at least according to Deep State, and which was confirmed actually through more images from Deep State and affiliates today. So this is exactly what I meant by post-truth, and the problem with this is not even new. If we go straight to the analysis of how Ukrainians dwelled in the post-truth, we can speak about the Ghost of Kiev, we can speak about Babushka with a jar, we can speak about the dude that shot 6, how much? It was 6, right? Cruise missiles with a hunting rifle. I mean, we more recently had the Bayraktar that had shot a Tupolev 95. Like, I mean, Ukrainians invented all and everything. And unfortunately for that, they didn't even have to actually invent all this bullshit because there were serious fuck-ups on the Russian side that were exploited. So the bigger problem with Ukraine, as I said, is that they start to embrace the post-truth almost immediately. The whole point for them is to dwell into this post-truth in order to avoid the responsibility of the actual losses. We've already discussed about the real attrition on the Ukrainian side, which went exponentially higher the last 2 months. Although this has nothing to do with Ukrainians themselves. The Ukrainians, especially in Kursk, were cut through by a completely new technology and an application of this new technology with other assets. So basically, Russians started to introduce synthetic aperture radars on drones. This allowed them to have a signature, even though the equipment, right, Ukrainian equipment was concealed. Once it was concealed, they were geolocated and the coordinates were given to drone operators. These drone operators, using optical fiber drones, would then, without being interfered or deterred or even felt, because this is the thing with optical fiber, as I said, you do not have a leak of radio frequency. So basically, a spectrum analyzer that is used usually for the wireless drones is useless. Therefore, you can catch them in the act. So basically, they're traveling down the road. You see them, you hit them. They will never see you coming until it's too late. And we've seen this multiple times, by the way. Now, the post-truth, as I said, is everywhere for Ukraine because it allows them to hide the bad decisions and allows them also to deflect responsibility. As I said, we started with Zaluzhny asking for X equipment, allies telling them it's too much, it's stupid, it's not going to work. He said, no, I need them, otherwise it's not going to, like, I'm not going on. He gets given more equipment. Okay, the quality isn't exactly what he would have liked, but still he got more equipment than what asked. And with this equipment, he goes to a counteroffensive in Zaporozhye that was telegraphed for centuries. He gets beaten his shit up. And then after that, he pretends that, oh, he saved the lives of his men by cutting the counteroffensive short. And we have a blame game, notably by some Ukrainians making up a story that, for instance, they would have thought about starting this counteroffensive earlier. And in Zaporozhye, when they were in defenses, and also pursuing Russian troops in Kherson. Never mind that they've blown most of the bridges that would have helped them to do that. Once again, we are speaking about post-truth Ukraine, which is simply unparalleled at this point. And once again, the claims over the Kursk spillover party, exactly the same thing. Not only we got a brazen lie, it's like, 80% of 100, so basically 80. Also pay very much attention to how Ukrainians, when they lie, compose their lies. They will not tell you straight up the story. They will not say, we fucked up like 60 guys or 48 guys or whatever. No. They will say a percentage of something as if you would accept it instead of checking the number. You would like, oh yeah, it's a high percentage, and it would alleviate that specific number, which would have been a problem. Like simply like look at the videos they showed about the 80 dead or 80% of 100 troops. Well, there is nobody near to 80, but on top of it, even what they show about the losses or the hits or whatever, don't look really like there was much there. But once again, I'm not judging the quality of that intervention or the defense, just saying how Ukrainians are projecting their incapability of defending or advancing in multiple areas and making out of it a complete shit show of made up stories. Now, as I said, this is something that you can see on every step. Veseloye, we had this PR bullshit by 225th. Then there were some advances. The most important of those, as I said, we have the North Korean. Once again, it's a political lie that was used as a cudgel in order to get, quote unquote, the decision out of the US authorities to strike within Russia proper, with ATACMS and other items. And we had a direct effect of that with an attack in Kursk and multiple other attacks, Bryansk, Toropets, and so forth and so on. The problem here is that, once again, a lot of shit was sold. I mean, Maluk came out and said, we blew up 160,000 tons in Toropets. I was like, nigga, do you even know how much volume you need for 160,000 tons? It's not 160 tons, it's 160,000 tons. So basically, the huge arms depot in Transnistria was said at its maximum to have had 22,000 tons of equipment and ammunition. Basically, it's roughly 8 times as much. Just go to the area of the Transnistrian depot, measure it, and imagine how much would you need to actually have 8 times that. Even 4, you're going to see it's simply not possible to have that kind of ammunition there. But once again, we are speaking about post-truth Ukraine. These guys are going to tell you stuff that you literally wouldn't believe. But they would believe. Initially, it wasn't like this. Initially, they admitted themselves it was there to boost the morale and sustain the march of the Ukrainian military, but also to its aid. But past 2023, they started to waver a myriad of bullshit stories to cover for both their lack of professionalism, lack of ideas when it comes to how to fight the war. I mean, imagine Krinky, guys. More recently, we learned that Krinky was a British idea, although once again, it looks to me like it's simply the Ukrainians trying to cover up the fact that they had a completely unhinged binge brainstorming of shit, let's say it like this, and ended up with this idea that somehow Krinky would have been a stepping stone towards Crimea. We know that a couple of other operations were tried like that. One of them was the Cape Tatancook attempt and Kinburg split attempt. I mean, a lot of guys got killed for nothing, but once again, post-truth Ukraine is a place where you're gonna send 1,400 people to die for 50 meters of advance within the Russian bank of the Dnieper. And you're gonna have Kursk when you send at least 8 to 10,000 people to die or get, go missing in there for basically a feel-good story. Because as I said, at the ratio and the rate it's going right now, I hope that within the end of March, we will never have to deal with the occupation of Kursk by Ukraine, but you never know. Now, the problem, once again, with the post-truth Ukraine, it's not just Kursk, or it's not just the way they are going to lie to people. It's the gaslighting. The problem with the Ukrainians gaslighting everybody else over Kursk, for instance, we've all seen that. In August, everybody was dunking on it, like, 3-day special operation done right. I mean, all the bullshit I'm not going to, I have to start, but I can show you screenshots. It was pretty hilarious. But at some point, of course, we can all remember Andy the pedo saying, "Oh, do not interpret images coming out from Giri in the wrong way." Well, there was no wrong way to interpret them. They lost 8 BTR-4s, bunch of guys got raped, and another bunch of guys got captured as prisoners of war. Like, there was no much to do there or to say there. But of course, no, Ukraine was advancing. Do not believe the naysayers, all the usual bullshit. Now, the problem with Kursk is that it affected the highest level of communication on Ukrainian side. You all remember Zelensky lying about the slowing down of the Russian offensive thanks to Kursk. You remember Zelensky lying about the number of losses, although we had a database with the names, places where these guys were killed, and so forth and so on. We remember Budanov saying bullshit. We remember, among other things, even Zelensky actually saying that everything was going according to the plan, our Ukrainian plan in Kursk. Once again, I might suffer from bias, but once again, the moment I said Kursk was the worst thing they could do, it ended up being the worst thing that Ukraine could do, because Kursk accelerated every single loss stat within the Ukrainian armed forces. Missing in action, killed, equipment destroyed, huge gaps on the Ukrainian capabilities, but also, most importantly, I think that the Kursk story that started very nice, that gave hope to a lot of morons, ended up actually causing a lot more people to flee from the Ukrainian armed forces, because suddenly, instead of fighting in Donetsk Oblast or in Zaporozhye or in Lugansk Oblast or in Kharkov Oblast, you were in fucking Kursk, which was basically the Bermuda Triangle for any fucking ukrop that would pass over there. And that Bermuda Triangle led to the Russians literally stepping up in savagery. And we had heads on pikes, summary executions, guys getting their heads chopped, guys getting taken hostage, stripped, put on the ground, and then ventilated. We had body desecration. We had basically every single horrible shit that you might think about happening to prisoners of war, including, a serial execution of them. So basically seeing what was going to happen to them and still taking it, which, was one of the worst things I felt, to be honest. But once again, that's what happened. That's what was supposed to happen to invaders in Ukraine. So basically, mutatis mutandis, you would find this exactly the same thing happening to assholes in Kursk, so basically in Russia. And of course, from the beginning, I think the Ukrainian leadership knew that the territory was going to be lost. Their whole, I think, attempt was somehow to drag it long enough for the Russians to give up on the territory by saying, okay, you got it, no big deal, we're going to exchange it somehow later on the discussions. This never happened. First of all, because it was a crime of lèse-majesty. I mean, how dare the Ukrainians occupy even a fucking inch of Kursk, although they had already tried before in 2023. Twice, once in Kursk, once in Belgorod, and then another time in 2024 in March for the elections. I mean, the usual bullshit, mostly a mix of retards from the RDK and the crops. Usually it would last within 24 hours, 72 hours, and it would end up in a bloodbath for them. I mean, the latest attack in 2024 cost them a record number of losses within the 48 hours that stuff lasted. And they didn't go further than 600 meters within territory. Then they got rolled back and absolutely destroyed. Now, the problem with Kursk, compared to all of these other things, is that the objective was even less tangible. As I said, at no point the Ukrainians established a tactical objective in Kursk. They established a strategic objective, which was, as I said, capture something, try to use it as a bargain chip, reverse the PR mood that was going against Ukraine, with everybody thinking that they were going to get hammered. And then they defined some absolutely non-shitty effects of the Kursk attack and invasion. One of those would be the uplifting of morale of the partners. So basically, you see, there are no red lines. The Russians are not going to nuke us because we invade them. And everybody was like, that has to be the most stupid shit ever. And once again, it's a post-truth thing. At no point the Russians were going to nuke them. If they hadn't nuked them when they were repelling them, rolling them back in Kherson and Kharkov, why the fuck would they blow them up in Kursk, where they could simply blow a couple of nukes in Sumy, for instance, they completely cut the logistics on the back. So it made no sense already. But as usual, Ukrainians are going to make up a narrative and then run with it and pretend like they did something great. It's a mental mark of a midget nation. People are going to call that fake nation? No. This is really the most provincial stuff ever. And it literally permeates from the Western Ukraine chip on the shoulder mentality, that somehow they need to take it to the Russians and show them that they can do stuff. And literally it's like the small retarded kid that's going to show you that he can kick the ball while you are in the varsity team or whatever. Doesn't really matter. I mean, it's the same Ukraine. The problem, however, is that, as I said, they enjoyed a complete and unparalleled backing from the West, which meant that everything that Ukrainians would say would be a sacrosanct truth. And the most evident example of this is that midway between 2023 and 2024, there were, for instance, a lot of sources would rely on still factual shit. So at some point, for instance, the leaks from the TWK files, especially around the losses, were sourced by the estimates done by Medusa over the Russian losses during the war. There was a method to the madness. There was a logic. You could estimate that. But after that, it was completely pulled out, and they used systematically the sources of the Ukrainian high command. which meant that you went from something that you could back on reality to something that automatically had nothing to do with it. I mean, at some point, Ukrainians were already at 280 planes in year one. And you're like, what the fuck? Same thing for tanks, for artillery. I mean, like, just look at the losses. Same way, or the way they started to count the losses. Initially, they had this counter that showed the killed in action. Then those guys became eliminated, then liquidated, and then when it was time to explain what the 860,000 people that were liquidated meant, well, then we had a version from the Ukrainian side, oh, it's about 198 killed and the rest are wounded and maimed and bullshit. And you're like, okay, based on what? Nobody actually gave a answer to that. And most recently, I've had a spat with one of the guys of Black Bird Group because he used a BS calculus from the usual asshole Tata the Gay, which allegedly were to show that the Russians had lost about 1 to 2 when it came to recoverables. And of course, it's based on nothing. It's literally based on Ukrainian made-up numbers. And once you analyze it with data that we have, and once again, I used another piece of information gleaned by Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, outside of Russia by a Russian defector. And as I said, even if we multiplied those numbers by 3, we still didn't have the kind of losses that Tata Gemi was trying to sell to the world, which was about 560,000 irrecoverable Russian soldiers against about 300,000 irrecoverables from the Ukrainian side. Of course, the whole analysis was bullshit, but that was the funny one because it literally relied on Ukrainian stats and Ukrainian numbers, which not only had nothing to do with reality, but have never been proven actually to even be based on footage or no, it's just based estimates, and if you believe them, it's fine. If you don't believe them, it's fine, just the same. However, once you start doing at least a modicum of statistic work, you end up understanding that, of course, the Ukrainian numbers are bogus, but they're not even bogus by the effect of them being false or unfalse. They are bogus simply because the leadership who relies on them openly lies about their own losses. Therefore, you apply the same usual stance to those losses slash successes of the Ukrainian forces, which is either you try to navigate through it, so you divide by 2 or by 3 or whatever, doesn't matter, or simply just throw it to the trash can, and that's what you should do. Because as I said, the moment when Zelensky sold 45,000 killed, actually it was initially 43,000, and 370,000 wounded, we already had over 62 to 65,000 killed in action, so a difference of 20,000, 22,000 for the largest gap. And of course, if you apply mutatis mutandis, the gap between the known losses and the declared losses to the wounded in action, then you have something that's completely different from what Zelensky is selling, and also explains the dire state of the Ukrainian forces with regards to people fleeing, people avoiding mobilization, and most importantly, the impossibility for them to cover the Russian attacks. And then slowly understood what was going on. Siersky and friends started poaching initially non-essential troops from other parts of the Ukrainian military, and then slowly they started to pinch more and more into the valuable and active forces and support forces of multiple wings of the military of Ukraine. So basically, there was a pilot, I think, a couple of remote personnel for aircraft, a couple of remote personnel for air defense operators, all that shit together, lumped and thrown to the assault. Then you had the problems with the mobilization from April 2024 to June 2024. And then slowly, what we remarked, the Ukrainians needed at least as much of a meat roll as the Russians to sustain their positions purely on defense. Now, of course, this is not funny. Like having to point out the Ukrainians that are completely out of the loop is not funny because people do not listen. The problem with the Ukrainian leadership right now is that they are on a suicidal trip. It's a one-way trip because somehow they got convinced that Russia is going to blow off some steam, or its economy is going to implode, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. For them is that we're going to outlast Russia. All we need is people to pay, feed us, and equip us. Now, the problem with that is that the core equipment, for instance, if you want mechanized brigades and so forth and so on, is scarce on a ready-to-go basis on the Ukrainian side, because it now is going to be mostly from Europe, given that the Americans are not going to deliver, although we're expecting a couple of other tanks. So basically, we should have about 49 Abrams somewhere between March and June. Those that were given by Australia. We should have a couple of more batches of Leopard 1 A5, potentially another batch of Leopard 2 A5, A6, A7. We are that badly right now. And of course, we are going to have the trickle-down element from other forces. We saw recently that Germany extended another 20 Marders, air defenses, all this shit. But still, we are at a level where the current rate of losses simply doesn't allow for those supplies to sustain Ukrainians much longer. However, there we go back to post-truth Ukraine. They do not care how much they're going to keep fighting. The logic for a lot of these people, especially Zelensky, is to keep fighting never matter what. We're approaching the very thin threshold from where you have to decide if taking out the leadership is going to unburden the rest of the population, the structure, is going to just have them stop fighting, or letting it go, because first of all, you need that leadership to sign your dotted papers, so you can basically enjoy, at least legally, the annexation of the four oblasts plus Crimea. And the risk is that offing him would get there someone either smarter or more radical, or both, and you have another type of war in your hands, which means that the goal of stopping the war with a small W or average W for the Russians would be actually gone. And that threshold, we're slowly going there, especially with what Zelia tried to do in Kursk the last month of occupation. And the main problem with Kursk right now is that it's still being covered by most of pro-Ukrainian fanboys as like something that it's either the apocalypse or an absolute beating of the Russians. And of course, once you start checking on the maps, you understand that, okay, there we got a problem, and these people are completely unhinged because they're lying. However, that lie is not that much of a problem for the Ukrainians. As I said, they've told worse lies, and it doesn't really fucking matter what people like you or me think about if it's tolerable or not to actually lie like that, because I mean it's gonna be obvious that you're bullshitting people. But for Ukrainians, that's not a problem. They have already stated multiple times that what is important for them is to be able to maintain the combat, to maintain the fight, and to be sure to offer more possibilities to resist. And more recently, in case you guys heard it, there was a captain of Azov battalion, I think, who said, right now we need peace, but with the best outcome possible for Ukraine, so we're going to keep our independence, democracy, and as much territory as possible. But also, we should not recognize the territorial changes Therefore, basically, these guys are saying to everybody, we will not make peace. The whole peace right now is about those territorial changes. So the make-believe on the Ukrainian side, the post-truth logic is that somehow we're going to lie brazenly by signing this dotted paper and accept this annexation, but in fact, this annexation is not worth the paper it's written on. And that's where you're going to have an expansion of the war, because clearly, if a ceasefire plus a deal is around the corner, the bellicose rhetoric of the European forces leads to everybody believing that these guys are not going to arm themselves to fight Russia. They're just going to arm themselves in order to deliver to Ukraine enough troops and equipment to try and do another Karabakh. Now, the problem, once you start thinking like that, especially on the Russian side, is that it gives you no other option but to finish it. And I already explained to you why it's very complicated for the Russians to play coy, because the insistence on having the legal borders of Kherson Oblast and of Zaporozhye Oblast changed the dynamics of the war in a completely different sense. By taking the Zaporozhye Oblast legally, they approach themselves out of nowhere to Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, of course, but most importantly to Dnipro city itself. And on Kherson beyond the Dnieper, as I said, they threaten two main points of Nikolaev Oblast, one of them being Nikolaev city itself, but the other being Kryvyi Rog. And given that they would have both the Zaporozhye axis to Zaporozhye city plus the push from Kherson towards Kryvyi Rog, you're going to have a kind of open salient which risks getting closed very fast if the Russians want to basically rush it. Now, a lot of people are going to say, yeah, but the Russians didn't manage to do this. I know. However, put the Russians to the same positions that they are supposed to be to an eventual deal while keeping the 4 blasts. Check the map. You're going to see you are giving them the possibility to at least bypass and isolate Kryvyi Rog right away by coming on both sides, one from Kherson Oblast and the other from Zaporozhye Oblast. And if things go awry for the Ukrainians, that could be another huge loss, because losing Kryvyi Rog, as I already pointed out, is losing a fuck ton of industries and an enormous fixed capital within Ukraine. So, for the Ukrainians, of course, there is no way they're going to accept the legal boundaries. But instead of saying that, what they're trying to say here is that, oh, we're going to accept prima facie the deal, but actually we're not going to accept it. And by making these declarations, okay, it's a low-level commissioned officer that made that statement, but the logic is there. And Zelensky keeps going by, we will not give up an inch of our land and stuff like that. At the same time, he said, I want to make peace. But unfortunately, peace, especially right now for them, is making compromises which need to be mirrored by the Russians at some point and at some level, because for sure the Russians, even if Kursk was to still be at 200 square kilometers under Ukrainian control, there is no sense to think that Russians are going to give 1, 2, 3, or 4 oblasts for that piece of land. So, the make-believe now on the Ukrainian side goes to another point. And of course, there is some merit to it because Trump is breaking their backs. He hasn't done anything terrible right now. The Ukrainians had a pause of almost 5 months when it came to American deliveries. Remember, from October to roughly March, October 2023 to roughly March 2024. And they were feeling the crunch, although it wasn't translated by the Russians into a total rollback of Ukrainian lines, it still showed extremely precarious for Ukrainians and almost got a bunch of positions completely overrun by both lack of logistics, but lack of equipment, but also simply lack of maintenance for some American weapons. So, once again, we have the make-believe, the post-truth Ukraine, where suddenly Ukraine is fighting against Russia, China that's neutral, the US that's the new ally of the Russian Federation, North Korea, Iran, and a flurry of other people because, why not? Of course, Ukrainians will not start saying that since 24th of February 2022, they have over 15,000 foreigners that have joined the ranks, with or without military experience, with or without access to US or European intelligence. So generally speaking, once again, the post-truth Ukrainian logic that's also tainted by ideology is everywhere. And that's why Kursk is so funny. Because from the beginning to the end, people were gaslit over Kursk. First of all, the operation was a failure from day one because they didn't manage to cross Korenova, so basically expand beyond the containment gap that you would have. So basically the heights were blocked. Part two was an attempt to make out of Kursk something else. Initially it was, we got a lot of POWs then. We're gonna go and capture a lot of land lease because remember they wanted to cut the same river by blowing up the bridges. That counterattack never came simply because the Russians simply called their bluff by attacking along the Snagost. And generally speaking, the problem with Ukrainians over there is the never-ending narrative of we didn't use anyone, actually everything was done by a few guys. The problem is that the number of equipment lost in Kursk simply belies that logic. Number of missing in action in Kursk, number of killed in Kursk simply belied the logic that somehow it was very little people. For the kind of operation that happened, Kursk has shown a tremendous amount of losses. With our account, as I said, based on the Oryx numbers, it's almost fucking 10% of the whole war, which is huge. However, the problem with Kursk, as we see it ending right now, and this is the takeaway, is that despite all the bullshit that was said about Ukrainians having the ascendance on drone technology, on UAVs, all that shit, Kursk was decided by 5 days of rabbit hunting from the Russian Federation drone operators to the single road that was open and that was still practicable in the thick of winter, which was, as I said, the Pisarivka-Yunakivka. And Zaloshenka-Suja highway. One road, 3 choke points, a fuck ton of FPVs, mostly optifiber. And if you followed the Rubicon group, you would know the toll. So it's about 150 vehicles of all kinds getting blown up. And those vehicles were literally the lifeline of most of the troops within the Suja salient. And for all the yap about how the Ukrainian FPVs are helping Ukraine turn the tide, all that shit, it's actually, once again, the Russians have managed to maximize the effect of the FPV by choking and cutting the supply line of a well-entrenched enemy over at least 400 square kilometers. So the FPVs literally led to the reduction of the pocket down to about 200 square kilometers right now, and probably to the extermination of the pocket itself. Once again, remember what is being said. Post-truth, Ukraine dominates on FPVs, yet it's been over a year that Ukrainian FPVs, the only thing they do is just stall the Russians up to a certain point where the Russians overcome that FPV ring. The other side, Russians accumulate FPV drone operators with optical fibers without them and start hunting and choking the whole supply line and making sure that the troops that are at the extremities of the salient in Kursk are hollowed out and then they're pushed out. And that's what it is. You starve, you fix, you starve, you eliminate. And we saw a couple of scenes. It's word of 20 to 40 prisoners of war on the tip of the salient. It was the attack on the column that was trying to leave Suja. We had more destruction around Martinovka, more destruction around Kazachstan and so forth and so on. So basically, the example set by the Russians right now is that if they have the time and the personal security for their teams, they are going to repeat this optifiber onslaught on every single area that they can narrow down, lock in, and just clean up with FPV drones. And that can be tanks, that can be trucks, that can be maps, that can be IVs. This is where the Ukrainians now should be paying attention to allow the Russians to bring, especially optifiber FPVs, around. It will not take long before a hole is being punched in the current offensive Kazi-Salia and Pokrovsk. And that's why people who are looking Kursk right now, I hope the Ukrainian leadership is paying attention, they can see exactly how Chasiv Yar is about to go. Chasiv Yar got the same circumvallation as Kursk, and the Russians have the heights. Not all of them, but they have most of the heights. So they can see the guys come through and push them out. Now we come to one question that was asked. What about Turets? What's going on? What went wrong for the Russians? Nothing went wrong for the Russians. The city is large. They were fighting a small unit tactic type of war. And the Ukrainians simply unloaded a bunch of new troops and decided to cut through to their biggest danger. Because, and I'm going to post a Telegram post by a Ukrainian non-commissioned officer, Sniper Alex, for people who want to know. And it says, right now in Chasiv Yar, there are no victories for us, but there are not victories for them either. As for Twerk, same thing. There are advances. We get gold, and what's happening most of the time is that the Russians now are not attacking anymore, which is fairly logical. It's easier to defend, even though people are going to go deeper into Twerk. But the issue is that if they lean on Chasiv Yar and take it out, if Chasiv falls, Twerk is going to fall as well. And that's, I already explained how it goes. If there is a unification of the line in Twerk, plus an advancement in Chasiv, and that Chasiv completely falls within the forest and the exclave rayon that is southwest on the main core of Chasiv Yar, then they're going to make the link up with Krimsky. Although allegedly Krimsky is completely retaken by the Ukrainians, as I said, it's going to be extremely complicated given that Chasiv Yar is a huge fortress, and Twerk itself also has a huge built-up area plus the private quarters, so basically the houses. It's going to be extremely complicated to try and control it as it stands right now without an extra amount of troops on both sides. Well, imagine what's going on. You're going to finish up Kursk, let's say, in 3 weeks. On the other side, you end up with the same situation. You were ending up with Bakhmut, at least the surrounding of Bakhmut in 2023, which is during the counter from May 14, more or less, up to September 2023. The Ukrainians took almost 100 square kilometers around the city and like a small speck trying to enter inside. They never managed to get the city back and were slowly backrolled after the Russian counteroffensive started on October 10th, 2023. So right now in Torsk, and also small bits of Pokrovsk, especially on the bulge southwest of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians are trying to swap the Kursk situation with Pokrovsk. But as I said, that's not how it should work. You cannot exchange about 40 square kilometers in Torsk and Pokrovsk against 400 square kilometers in Kursk. Of course, the logic is it's Russian territory, so them having to fight for it, it's not that bad for Ukraine because those troops are not in Ukraine. Yes, but for how long? Once again, we go to the post-truth logic. You're going to get back 10 square kilometers, wow, super nice. And you have done what with that? Just get into city battles when you didn't need to have them before. Remember? It was FPVs blocking them. And you have the same problem happening right now to them. The Sisyphus syndrome and paradigms I explained to you guys over 2 years ago. It's happening. Attacking is always more dangerous when the adversary has the exact same tools as you. In this case, the FPVs, plus the optical fiber FPVs, plus artillery, plus everything, are contributing to this attrition of the Ukrainian forces. And the problem, once you start looking at it like that, is how much and how deep are these guys going to go? And you can understand, not that deep, not that much. And we are not even up to the 10% of what the Russians lost in Bakhmut surroundings in 2023. And it's been going for at least 3 months. But let's say it started mid-January. It's going to be 2 months now that they're trying. And we can talk about Russian lack of manpower and stuff. At the end, the guys who are getting killed, guys who are losing equipment in the air, it's not the Russians. Ukrainians are throwing Bradleys, are throwing Leopards 1A5s, are throwing T-64s and stuff like that for literally nothing. And the counterattacks in Dachne, counterattacks in Shevchenko, you can see that what they want is the Russians not to expand to the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. And that's why it's once again a kind of operation of make-believe, because you're throwing good money after bad money. You're throwing good resources after failing to expand bad or excessive resources, and you grab them and send them to Kursk. So, to recap the whole situation, the end of Kursk was previsible. Of course, as I said, I was thinking about it ending around mid-September, even beginning of October, because it made no sense the way that the Ukrainians had formed this strike group with all this hodgepodge equipment, this complete split of command and control, and also the early failures. I mean, initially it looked like good and everything, and then suddenly within 1 day, despite everybody claiming that Korenovo this, Giri that, Martinovka this, and Pogrebki that, we ended up with a fairly limited advance once you start thinking about it. And that meant that because this NAS, this salient wasn't big enough, suddenly the Russians started to call them. You may remember, if you follow the Gelsio, the first weeks, even the first weeks of the whole situation were not going that well for the Ukraine loss-wise. At some point, they started 1 to 4, then got up to 1 to 2.5, and then they ended up with the current roughly 1-1 or 0.89 to 1, according to Gelsio. But in reality, when you start counting properly, it's more like 1-1. Now, actually, even far worse, to be honest. It's 1.2 Ukrainians for 1 Russian. But that's not the big problem. The problem is that proportionally, the type of losses the Ukrainians are getting is simply unsustainable. That's why they're pulling back, by the way. But at the same time, we're analyzing Kursk, you can see every single flaw in the general Ukrainian doctrine for everything. And that is, I'm going to repeat, flawed perception of the risks, bad planning, hodgepodge ad hoc planning, lack of grand strategy, but we already explained this about how the fact they're seeing some stuff, and much of it has to do with the fact that they do not have much of a choice. I mean, they're a smaller country, and the kind of aid they're receiving right now is for a war that is not the same anymore. Short-term, flashy actions against long-term attrition approaches. And most importantly, everything is done tightly coordinated with PR and a huge dose of post-truth. Once again, this affects both sides. But unless, like, we are speaking about very early days, Ukraine has built this as part of its strategy and part of its scope. With the Russians, it's different. Russian post-truth is also so stupid sometimes. Like you see Konashenko going out saying, we destroyed 3-4 HIMARS. Like, bro, come on. Like, they only got 30. You know? But that's not, what I say, that's part of course, because you have to have this back and forth between both ministries, throwing shit to each other. We killed 300 of your guys. We killed 400. No, we killed 600. No, we destroyed 2,000 tanks. No, we destroyed 2,000 artillery. Like, there is this very weird Adin Narod mirroring effect of both sides, which like completely denies any kind of seriousness that you want to give to the Ministry of Defense or Interior to both sides. But there is where both sides also give you the reality, sometimes unfiltered. And that's why it makes it so obviously post-truth, because post-truth is not the outright lie. Post-truth is mostly implying lies, exaggerations, gaslighting, based on something that has existed. So when Ukrainians say that, they used X weapon to do X damage, the post-truth is showing something, making a Kuleshov effect to something else, and saying we got it. We have this a lot with pro-Ukrainian idiots that are posting 3, 4, 5, 6 months, a year old footage from Russia in order to give the impression that things are changing. Most recently, Azov posted some shit from Nelipivka in the tourist New York area that you can see could not be from February or January or even March, because you had less vegetation with some sign of end of summer. Yet it was published by everybody, and the Russians do the same, by the way. They also publish all the reruns. But in case of Ukraine, this is not released nilly-willy. They know exactly what they're doing, and the people willingly spreading this bullshit. Pro-Russians have the same kind of narratives. This not like try to become more Catholic than the Pope. But on the Ukrainian side, the people who consume this, either they're botted, like a full range of bots, either they're stupid. Because a lot of things just don't make sense, like the story with the Bayraktar shooting down an A295 over the Caspian. You're like, the Bayraktar doesn't have the fucking range of communication to go over there. On top of it, from where would it go? You know? So once again, we are with logic of absolute nonsense when it comes to pro-Ukrainians that is in fact the strategy they chose to communicate. The insistence on genocide, the hyperbole on how the Russians are going to rape, kill, and plunder everything, the gaslighting over what is a foreign combatant, what's a volunteer, what's a mercenary. Like, we've had these. I'm not going to start to dwell on it, but just a sign that if something's going to explain the loss of the Ukrainian forces, except the disparity with Russia, it is going to be that Ukraine started to lie to itself pretty early on. And that was it. And that's why they are losing in Kursk. That's why they're going to lose. If nothing changes the war based on the trajectory that both sides are going through right now. Last but not least, if the Ukrainians do not solve the situation in Siversk, and of course in Chasov Yar, then they will have to do another front flip. You have also the area in Kupiansk. That means that the defense of Pokrovsk as it stands like now is going to get beaten back. Not only because the Russians are going to transfer those forces, those drone-ups from Kursk to Pokrovsk, or to Toretsk, doesn't actually even matter. But also because the whole game, this war since Russia 2023, has been the Russians changing the main axis of their assaults in order to create a disbalance over the line of contact. And I'm completely understanding what's happening, for instance, in Seversk and Verkhokamyansk, as well as in Zarishnya Kupiansk. The Russians are doing what they have done all over this war since they decided to limit themselves in Donbass, which is change the axis of the game, start fresh, and start probing a completely different direction. Of course, there is war there as well, but a dormant direction suddenly wakes up, and Bielorivka, that stayed untouched for years, fell. Remember, Tatagimi said Bielorivka is the way to go for the Ukrainian defense. Once again, make believe, post-truth. And I already explained why. Bielorivka is extremely specific. It's a very defender-favorable position, defender-friendly situation, and yet it fell. We had Ugledar that was just the same, and also fell. Bakhmut, down. Once again, guys, I repeat, think out of the box, even if it shows that, like what you are thinking about Russia, Ukraine, whatever, is wrong. Always think out of the box. Always see in Ukrainian statements, unless backed by facts, a post-truth attempt to justify or wag the dog. And therefore I'm expecting bombastic statements in the same vein as the 80% of the 100 guys killed from the Ukrainian forces to explain how the fact they got kicked out of Kursk in a couple of days, that they were defending for 6 months. That was it. Thank you very much for the space, guys. See you this Wednesday for the Q&A. Thank you very much once again. Have a nice evening. Bye.